I'd like to introduce Sydney Stevens. Oh, you all know her. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good old Sydney.
Okay,
Sydney is, this is a experiment in terror for us. We're trying to honor authors, local authors, and have book signings and book talks and I owe Sydney a lot. She has allowed me to work my way into publishing and actually writing magazines. And wasn't for her and Doug Allen, I probably would never have learned what I've learned.
is that right? Oh,
Yep, I appreciate
that's
it.
an awesome responsibility, isn't it? I'm glad
Yep,
I'm
yep.
glad, I'm
It's all
glad it
good.
worked. You were a really good student.
Yeah. And,
You did a fine
and I
job.
need hip boots, so you keep going.
So I thought a lot about what I was going to say to all of you. And I can see that I really didn't need to, because you probably already know everything I'm going to say. But, usually authors give book talks when they have a new book out. I don't have a new book out. And so everything I'm going to talk about, you probably already know. So I thought I would talk about a hoped for book. And that is, and it looks like it's going to come together and it'll be fine. And if you get the Chinook Observer, you've been reading some of the stories that will be in that book. I called it Saints and Sinners, and when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, my great Aunt Dora and my grandfather, brother and sister, loved to tell stories. And we didn't have TV, of course, and in Oysterville, and Lord, there was barely radio, as a matter of fact. And so if Aunt Dora, she lived in Lake Oswego, and when she was here visiting, she would come and have dinner at the house, and she and my grandfather would get to telling stories. And Papa told about the saints. He always told about all the wonderful people of his childhood and the people that he remembered, the characters, as well as the people who contributed to the community and so on. Aunt Dora talked about the sinners. And you know who I was most interested in listening to. And every once in a while, I do remember this, that every once in a while, Aunt Dora would get going a little bit, and somebody would say, "Little pictures have big ears." And that was my cue to leave. And so, or Aunt Dora would change the subject, but she didn't very often. So a couple years ago, I was talking about those saints and sinners characters to Matt Winters, and saying that I was starting to write some of those stories up. And I told him about one of those stories, and he loved it. And I can't even remember now which one it was. I think it was one of the first ones that he published. And he just listened and listened. And when I finished telling him, he said, "I want those." And I said, "Okay, with a caveat." I said, if you publish one a week, and always put them in the same place in the paper so people will get used to looking for them, I'll let you have them. And so I didn't tell him where, and he chose the exactly right place as far as I was concerned, which was the second section, the bottom of the second section. And usually he manages to fit the whole story. Sometimes he has to continue it inside. So this week it's John Moorhead, and he's definitely one of the saints, I think. but last week it was, oh, and I should say, I'm working on story number 73 now. So for 73 weeks, we've had stories or for 70 weeks, we'll say. And the one I'm working on right now is Ruth Dixon, who was, I feel like I'm in her territory. Ruth Dixon, of course, started the Sou'wester, and I bless her every day because I use the Sou'wester extensively in my research. And if it weren't for the Sou'wester, there wouldn't be this series. And I'm hopeful that it will be published. I have my feelers out, and I have there's going to be, fingers crossed, a new publisher in the works here pretty soon, within the next year, doing just Northwest stories and publications, and we need that. It's been a long time since we've had any small press publishers for the Northwest, for other than poetry. The poets get there, but the rest of us don't.
Do.
So I wanted to tell you a little bit about those, and that there is a book in the offing, and I've sort of set myself as a cutoff at 100 stories. When I've done 100 stories, I think I'll probably be kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel, although the hard thing is not finding the characters and the saints and the sinners. It's finding the information about them, and I also I wish there were more people here from this area, but I'm concentrating on Pacific County and Southwest Washington, and of course I have loads of Oysterville and Peninsula saints and sinners because that's who I know, and that's even some from my own lifetime. I don't have as many from over here, and so if you have suggestions, bearing in mind that I can come up with names, but finding the information is the hard part. And so if you've got names for me, do tell. So I went to bed last night thinking about that, thinking that there, I want to tell you about some other books too, which I will, and some mistakes I've made, and that turned out to be okay. And this morning I'm still stewing a little bit. Am I going to talk about saints and sinners? And I opened my email and I got this note from Doris Bussey. And I met Doris here at Ray Hicks' birthday party. And she and I had communicated before that about Ray, but I met her here. And all of a sudden, and so we've communicated back and forth. So this morning I get this in the mail. Oh, one other thing before I read you this. The other thing that occurs to me over and over and over again when I'm doing these stories or any historic research is that we have to get each other and people we know to write their stories, because that's where our history is. If the stories aren't there, we're not going to know the history. Our history today, if you think about it, if we don't write our stories, will be exactly the history that most of us learned in school. The names and dates of battles. That's it. And I hated history. It was boring and it related to me not at all. I didn't know what the people looked like, what kind of clothes they wore, how did they make their clothes, what were their stores like, did they have stores? How far did they have to travel? How did they travel? What were the roads like? What? and I struggle with that now with the history of this area. Thank goodness were people that wrote down those things. Thank goodness some people saved letters, and with the gossip. That's where the history comes from, the gossip and from the little tidbits that people tell each other. It's not the stories of the battles. I'm sorry, that ain't it. So my other passion, if you want to call it that, is urging people to write their memoirs. And it doesn't have to be so fancy schmancy as memoirs. Write a story of something that happened to give to a grandchild, or just a memory of something. But write it down, put it someplace where it will be passed on. And because I know, I remember Aunt Dora's sinner stories. I remember them word for word, I'm sure. But then I read my Uncle Willard's stories that Aunt Dora told. Just a little bit different. So, so who knows? Anyway, so here's what Doris wrote in my email first thing this morning. Your article in today's paper. So she must have written it yesterday. Yeah, she wrote it 10:51 p.m. last night. Your article in today's paper reminds me when I was 5 in 1946, Mom and Dad took me to Long Beach and we had fried clams out of the frying pan. The article is W for Wellington. It's about Wellington Marsh and the beginnings of Marsh's Museum, okay? I remember it was a hot day and we had to stand in line for a long time. And I watched the man turn the clams with a long handled wooden paddle. It was the first time I had razor clams, and I loved them. They had potato salad and corn, I believe, on the cob. I have written the story in my memoirs for my children and grandchildren, and have a picture of the newspaper article of the original frying pan with the story. Thanks for the memories. Keep up the good work. And I thought, that's it. She said it all. She said, oh, now I can go home, right? But that was great. I really loved it. And every time someone does contact me about one of these stories and relates it to something that they've done, it just warms the cockles of my heart. That's what history should be all about. So now I'll tell you about some of the stories that I have had published or have published, and first I'm going to tell you the biggest mistake I ever made. Still a mistake, and but I love these books. The mistake was my ABC's books, and the reason I call them a mistake is because people assume that ABCs are for children. They forget that ABCs can also mean basic information. And it just never occurred to me when I was writing them, and I'm a teacher, and I teach for second, third grade. It never occurred to me that people would not get the point that these were for adults. They were not for children. But I couldn't even explain it to booksellers who put the books this way on the shelf, so you couldn't even see what the title was, in the children's section. Bad mistake. On the other hand, great way to deliver information. And for the people that finally figured it out, and when I browbeat booksellers and they would sell the books the right way, they figured it out. So my favorite one, and the one that you have here, and I think everybody that lives in Pacific County should have a copy of this, is K is for Kidnapping the County Seat. The ABCs of early government in Pacific County, Washington. And I'll give you an example of why I think this way of delivering information is great. One of the things in K is for kidnapping the county C. The format is ABC, okay? A is for area. It tells about the area of Pacific County. It's for assessor, what the assessor is, and it tells a story about an early assessor and auditor, okay? And I could choose anything. I chose the things that have tickled my fancy. B is for before, okay? So, and it's for boundaries, and it's for Bruceville. The beginnings in this little box, it says, Oregon Territory, 1848. Pacific County, 1851. Washington Territory, 1853. Washington State, 1889. And the verbiage says, long before there was a Washington State. Indeed, even before there was a Washington Territory, there was Pacific County. It was created February 4th, 1851 by the Oregon Territorial Legislature. At that time, Oregon Territory was bordered by the British possessions, British Columbia, on the north, by a vast unorganized territory on the east, and by the state of California and the territory of Utah on the south. Pacific County was the third county to be created north of the Columbia River. Who knows that stuff? This is where you find out. That's what I say. And the other thing that is interesting in this, I think, and I haven't come to grips with this completely yet. I want to do more about this. B's for boundaries. 7 boundary changes shaped Pacific County to the form it now holds. The first change was defined in the first regular session of the Washington Territorial Legislature in 1854. The last was approved November 13th, 1879. And people ask me, why haven't you talked more about Russell and Strong and some of the movers and shakers when Swan was here, and they were our first commissioners and county dignitaries, county officers. Wasn't Pacific County. That's why they weren't in Pacific County. The boundaries changed 7 times, and I'm not even sure. Was it Chehalis County then? And then it became another county, and then I don't know what they all are. I haven't done enough with it, but things like that I think people need to know a little bit more about. And certainly those of us on the peninsula, we don't know that Q is for Quality Hill, Alta Vista Hill, Knob Hill, Quality Hill, and Snooze Hill. And these are all in South Bend, right?
Yeah.
And you know where they are.
I live on Quality Hill.
Do you?
Whoa.
Well, of course.
Proudly.
Of course you do. So I just think, another thing that, another part of this one that I think is great is, N is for null and void. Okay,
I'm sorry, N is for what?
null and void. No
Oh.
more.
Sort of like the county seat at Oysterville?
Yeah, null and void, yes, but this is more job oriented. Harbor master. This elected official had full authority to regulate and station all ships, steamers, and other crafts in the harbors of Pacific County, and to remove crafts not engaged in receiving or discharging ballast or cargo. He also could order the removal of all obstructions in the harbors under his jurisdiction. But The one I like best is Rec Master. This elective office was created by the territorial legislature in 1854 for all counties of Washington Territory that bordered the Pacific Ocean. It was the Rec Master's duty to assume charge of any marine wreck after it had been abandoned and to save all of it that was possible for the benefit of the owners. He was charged with protecting wrecks and their cargoes from the seagulls, a local term that referred to people who helped themselves to treasures that littered the beach after a shipwreck. The wreck master was allowed a salvage of 10%, and he was required to file a bond of $2,000. The office no longer appeared on the ballot after 1914.
That's in the last Southwester too.
Is it? In the last Southwester.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
In
not.
fact, Vince Shoddy's put me onto it.
Yeah, that's great.
It's a great story.
Then, and there was a salmon inspector, county school superintendent, of course. No longer used
Never
after.
quite sure what they did.
They did it same thing as the well, are you sure what district superintendents do? Because they did the same job, except it was for the whole county, because there weren't school, the district, they were in charge of each little district.
But it was a county superintendent of schools.
Yeah.
Neil Bailey was the last one.
Who?
Neil Bailey.
Don't know.
Lived right at the bottom of the hill below the cemetery in Menlo.
So, that's K is for kidnapping, which is still in print. I is for Indians, I think, is also still in print. And I have to tell you about I is for Indians. This was the first ABC book I did, and it was illustrated by Pat Fagerlund, as was Kidnapping. They weren't all illustrated by Pat, but many of them were. But I was worried when I did this one, because it was right at a time when we were being told vociferously by everybody. The copyright is 1999. That we should no longer be saying Indian. And I was not about to name it I is for Indigenous people, and I did not want to call it C is for Chinooks. And so I went to Charlotte Davis and to her twin sister Catherine Troe, who were both very active in the tribe, and I asked them, and they just looked at me like I was mad. And they said, "But we are Indians," over and out. So it's I is for Indians. And this one really mystifies me as far as being sold as a children's book, because you only need to take one look at it and you know that the vocabulary isn't for children. It's not a children's book, but it's a wonderful overview of the Chinook culture early on. And before I published it, I took it to the tribe and had their cultural office vet it. And so I feel good about it, and I feel really good about the fact that they also sell it in their museum. So this is one of the few books that has sold well, and I have put back in print.
Can I have your
But,
key?
Indians are in vogue again.
Indians,
Yeah, it's in vogue again.
that's good. I was on the cutting edge. Okay, then the C is for cranberries. I'll just tell you, I think this is funny. C is for cranberries is still in print. And I got a lot of my information. Gordon Shavy did the illustrations for this one, and I think I lied. I think that I did this one. This was the first one, 1998. Yeah, Gordon and I did this one the first, and I love his illustrations. They're just kind of zooey and nutty. And he always has. He had an alter ego who was usually had one martini too many, and I don't think he. And his name was. God, I just had it. He had a weird name like. I can't think of it now. But anyway, he was sober throughout this book, but he shows up now and then in the book. Anyway, the thing I want to tell you about this book is, again, it's obviously not for children, and E is for equipment, and G is for growers, and I don't know. It's just not. It's not a children's book. However, well, people still buy it for their children. That's too bad. But I went to a party once, not a children's party, an adult party, and a young man, probably in his 20s, came up to me, and he said, "Are you Sidney Stevens?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "I want to thank you." And I said, "You're welcome. Why?" And he said, "Because." He said, "I have bought the property that is known as the Martin Bog." Do you know the Martin Bog? He said, "I bought the property that's known as the Martin Bog." And he said, "I want to reestablish Cranberry Bog there." And he said, "I went to talk to Kim Patton, the WSU Extension agent, and I talked to a lot of growers, and I've gotten a lot of information, and I struggled." And he said, "And then I ran across your book." And he said, "I came across the part that says how to grow cranberries." And he said, "They're growing." And he said, that this is what helped me the most. Who knew? A manual for how to grow cranberries. Anyway, one of the things I thought was interesting too in this book is L is for laws, and I did know this, but I had forgotten until I wrote the book. 2 pieces of legislation have been written specifically for cranberries. At the federal level, cranberries are considered an obligate wetlands plant and are, therefore, given congressional exemption for production on wetlands. So there you are. And at the state level, growers on the Long Beach Peninsula may take sand from the beach to be used for sanding the bogs, a process which must be done when creating a new bog and every 3 or 4 years thereafter, and they use a lot of sand. And so, nobody else can go and take sand from the beach just willy-nilly. It's against the law. But not if you're a brewer. Okay, so some of my ABC books are out of print now, and I'll tell you, you'll figure out why. Always for Oysters is out of print, and I'm really sorry about that. But I just decided I couldn't afford to put it back in print at this late date. And what's the Goose Point Cannery people? Is that Goose Point?
Yeah.
Yeah, called me a few years ago, and they had a new gal working there, and she wanted to. She thought it would be great if the company gave each of the kids. I didn't explain. Each of the kids O's for Oysters as a Christmas gift, which is a lovely idea, but it was out of print. And I thought, if I were a few years younger and had a bit more energy, I'd go to all the canneries and see if they wouldn't like to pool their resources and get the book reprinted, you know, not for the kids, but for people, because people are very interested in it. And it does talk about early oystering, tonging, and T is for tonging, and tide terms, and good book, but no more. But sometimes you see it at garage sales, and
So-
you know, so
Approximately how much would it cost?
to reprint it, I have no idea now. I really don't. But think about it.
Yeah, we've talked about doing some of that as a museum.
Yeah, it was a good seller. Another one that's out of print, but it's not worth bringing back, was Diaz for Discovery, and it was about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And of course, it sold, you know, at the time, came out right at the right time, and it sold very well. And it's no more. And then and one other that is still in print as far as I know. When I did Diaz for Discovery, somebody from Troutdale saw it and asked if I would do one about Lewis and Clark's time in the Troutdale area. And they did indeed stop at the Sandy River, and they had some problems at the Sandy River because of the quicksand. So I did Q is for quicksand for the Troutdale Museum. They paid for the production and all of that, and the copyright is theirs, and I think it's still in print, and they have exclusive rights to it. So that was fun to do. And of course, I got all the information from the journals, from Moulton's wonderful, you know, edition. So that's about the ABC books, and you have the most important one here, K is for Kidnapping, so that's good. Then the other thing I was going to talk to you a little bit about was the ghost stories. Because, you know, most of my books are pretty straightforward. I have one on Oysterville, one on cranberries, one on this. I'm not talking about these. I'm talking about my regular Arcadia publications, and on the IRNN, the railroad, and I don't know. There's maybe 8 of them, and still in print. Well, they'll always be in print, I think. So they're mostly pictures, historic pictures, and information, and they're great, and people love them and buy them, and they sell well. But then Arcadia had a new section called their Haunted series, and they asked if I would be interested in doing a haunted book, and we have a ghost in my house, and I thought that would be fun, but I didn't. I really didn't know. I knew about one other ghost in Oysterville, and so I asked around to see if there would be enough ghosts to warrant a book, and there were, and so I wrote ghost stories, and in the process of doing that, realized it's a wonderful vehicle for history, because most ghosts lived a long time ago and have come back to haunt us, and so you can talk about the way things were when they lived, where they lived, what it looked like, all of the wonderful historic things that we want to know about. So I wrote, of course, the first one I wrote about was the ghost in our house, Mrs. Crouch, and you probably know all about, more than you want to know about Mrs. Crouch. She still makes herself manifest now and then. I had never really heard of her until I hadn't moved up here full-time yet,
No problem.
and, I came up for vacation, and I don't know if I was house sitting for my folks or what the deal was, but, when I got in late at night and I was in a rental car. I'd rented it, from Seattle. I came from California, and, so, and I had my typewriter, a portable electric, with me, which I didn't wanna lug up the stairs in the house, and so I left it downstairs. And, was late, and I was exhausted, and I went to bed. And, I'm just getting to sleep, and I'm thinking, what is that? I turn on the light, nothing. Turn off the light, just dozing off. I thought, such a familiar sound, and my dad had said they had squirrels in the gutters, and I thought, no, it doesn't sound like squirrels. I think they'd make a kind of a scratchy sound. It wouldn't be a tapping. So I went through the light on, no sound, light off, tap, tap, a couple of times, and finally thought, well, the heck with this. Turned the light on, got up, and tried to locate where the sound was coming from, which was hard. And it seemed to be coming from the smallest bedroom, which was right next to the bedroom I was in. So I went in there, and on the table, the nightstand next to the bed, instead of a lamp or whatever, was a typewriter, but it was the weirdest looking typewriter you've ever seen. And it didn't have a ribbon. And I don't know, it was just weird looking, but it was recognizable as a typewriter, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, that's what's making the noise. Okay, I went to bed and to sleep, over and out. And so when my folks got home from wherever they were, before I left to go back, I thought to ask my mom what that, where'd that typewriter come from. She said, oh, they called from the museum. And I think it was Ruth Dixon that called, because it was in the it was before I moved up here, and that was 78, so it was probably in 72 or 3. And Ruth said that my Aunt Mona had lent the museum some artifacts, among them that typewriter, and Ruth said they were doing some reorganizing, and would we like to give these things, gift them to the museum, or did we want them back? But they couldn't stay on loan anymore. And so my mom said, well, Bill and I'll come over and take a look at them. And one of the things was this typewriter. She had never seen it before either. And so she figured that Mona had been rummaging in the attic and found it, and so she brought that home. She thought it was interesting enough that it should stay in our house, which is kind of a museum too. And so that was the story on that. We still don't know really anything about it, and I certainly don't know how to use it. But so I told my mom in the course of that about my experience. Oh, she said, that was Mrs. Crouch. Who's Mrs. Crouch? she said, Mrs. Crouch? You don't know about Mrs. Crouch? No. Well, she was married to the first preacher in the church across the street. And it was the Baptist church, and the Baptists had a congregation and a church since 1863, but they had never saved enough money for a building. So finally, RHSB got tired of that. He donated the land and $1,500, bought plans, we thought, but what it turned out to be was a kit, a church kit from someplace back east, and everything came like those Sears houses, and the church was built by the local carpenter, put together by the local carpenter. And that was in September of 1892. It was completed. In January of 1893, the first preacher arrived, and his name was Josiah Crouch. Josiah Crouch arrived in Nakata at the end of the train line, and I think my grandfather, who was 16 then, met him with a buggy, and Crouch came with his wife, young wife, and a baby, maybe 18 months old, maybe younger than that at that point. His mother and his younger brother, who was 15, so right about my grandfather's age, so that was cool. And so they settled in. Oh, and meanwhile, because Oysterville was so isolated, still is sort of, they had always had trouble keeping a preacher, even though they met in RH's home, and the preacher would come, an itinerant preacher would come and stay maybe for 6 weeks at the house, but it was hard to get people to do that. So the Crellin brothers had moved to San Francisco, and Tom Crellin's house was right across from the church and was vacant. And so RH bought to be the parsonage. He thought if he could offer housing to the Baptist minister, that he'd have a better chance of keeping the minister. And so I've heard, and I ought to be able to find this out, but I never have really taken the time. My understanding is he bought that house for $250. Can you believe it? I mean, it's a huge house. It's huge. Anyway, times have changed. So here comes the Crouch family, and they move into the house. Papa's diary said each Sunday, Reverend Crouch preached 2 good sermons. I don't know if he had a morning and an evening service. I have no idea, but he always preached 2 good sermons on Sundays. And then sometimes, well, in the summer, they would go to Nakata, and Harry, my papa, would take Reverend Couch and the son, I think his name was Charlie, to Nakata to preach a sermon there. And I don't know, there wasn't a church in Nakata, so I don't know where they preached the sermon. But the only times Papa noted it in his diary was that they didn't have a service after all. There was a ball game instead. So I'm sure that's why he was so interested in going to Nakata. The people of Oysterville were the Baptists anyway, were very happy with the church, and they had a preacher, although he was a little too friendly with the women in the congregation. He had a little eye for the women. And Tommy Nelson said, and he said this later in life too, I knew Tommy. I never heard him talk about Mrs. Crouch though, but my mother did, that his sister went calling on Mrs. Crouch, and Reverend Crouch, or Pastor Crouch, came and kind of got in front of her, and between Mrs. Crouch and his sister, and his sister kept backing up, and he kept coming. She didn't like that very much, and she never went calling on Mrs. Crouch again. Mrs. Crouch was shy. She didn't come out very much, but people could hear her sweet soprano voice singing to her baby as they would walk by on the street. The elder Mrs. Crouch, his mother, joined the village sewing bee, and Charlie is his brother, went to the two-story school, and so they were settling in. So in the summertime, Crouch went on church calls across the bay and up the Willapa River, and he would go and call on farming families and various families that would like to have a baptism or whatever, and he took his wife and baby with him. I imagine he borrowed someone's sailboat, because I doubt that he had one himself. And so at one farmhouse where they stopped, there was another farm not too far away, and Crouch, rather than sailing there, asked the farmer if he had a rowboat he could borrow. And the farmer said yes. And so Mrs. Crouch wanted to go too. And so the three of them, the baby and Mrs. Crouch and the pastor, went. And as they rowed along, he was rowing, and she asked if she could take a turn trying to row. And he said, well, he thought that would be fine. And this is what he said afterwards. And so she transferred the baby to him, and then they had to, trade places. And somehow in doing that, she lost her balance and fell out of the boat, and the boat overturned, and he and the baby fell in too. He was able to save the baby, but not Mrs. Crouch. And so he came, and interestingly, the paper had a lot about it. I don't know what paper would it have been, the Journal then, South Bend Journal, 1892.
Yeah.
And they said that the farmer, where the place he was returning to, the farmer whose boat it was, said that they saw him coming, but he wasn't coming fast. He wasn't walking fast, and they thought that was strange. And anyway, he reported it, and so quickly the farmer got neighbors, and they all brought rakes, and they raked to find her body, which they did. Crouch told where he had last seen her hat, and so they found her body, and the women prepared her for burial, and she was buried in the Fernhill Cemetery, I believe. And but the women who laid her out said that there were marks on her neck, and they were concerned about that. And so there was pressure brought to bear by the people of Oysterville to have her exhumed, which they did in two or 3 days. They had her exhumed, and there were two physicians and at least one attorney, and I think the sheriff at the exhumation, is that the word? And but there'd been too much deterioration. They could not tell if there were finger marks or marks from the rake on her neck. So there was no conclusion drawn. And they did have a hearing, and one of the jurors actually said that the way they wrote their findings was meant to leave it what's the word I want, unsettled or whatever, that they could not make up their minds. So meanwhile, Crouch goes back to Oysterville with the baby, as presumably his mother is taking care of the baby now, and he continues going to Nakata and having 2 sermons every Sunday in Oysterville, and but the community is upset, and they're pressuring the police or the sheriff to issue a warrant. And so finally a warrant is issued, and he beats feet and is not served. He gets out of town. And the rumor was, and this is still a rumor, the current rumor even, is that he left with another man's wife. We don't know. And that he took the baby with him, and that might be true, his own baby. That might be true, because he does show up with the little girl later in California. Meanwhile, he leaves his mother and brother at the house, and she has no money. And so she is pressuring my great-grandfather to let her sell the furniture in the house so she'll have money to get home. And he says, no, you can't do that. And all of this I know from letters that my great-grandmother wrote to her children who were away at school. And so finally RHS gives her the money to go home to Nebraska, I think. Meanwhile, the stories are coming in about Crouch making his way to California, preaching at various places, although they know that he's on the run from Oysterville. The word is out, and Oysterville issues something to all the Baptist churches, and it's very, very complex. Okay, so that's this story. And so I said to my mother, well, why is she hanging around our house? And Mom said, because she was happy here. So that's okay. And we still have evidence of her. And so her story is in her story actually is in Ghost Stories of the Long Beach Peninsula. So, and along with other ghost stories. So, when this came out, my cousin Ralph is a character, and he lives in West Virginia. I think all people in West Virginia are characters. Anyway, he and he's great at research, and so he got intrigued about Josiah Crouch, and so he did a lot of research about what happened to Josiah. Well, we did know in book one, the first phase, we did know that he became an attorney in San Francisco. Within a year and a half, I think, of his leaving Oysterville, he became an attorney. And then he ran into some difficulties with the law. And so he was working the law on both sides.
I'm confused. Who's Josiah?
Josiah, Reverend Josiah Crouch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he became an attorney. So,
That's scary.
so my cousin decides he wants to find out more about Josiah. And what we found out was he lived till 1944. We already knew, Oysterville already knew shortly after he left, because they got a letter from his first wife that he was a bigamist. He never got divorced, and when he married Sarah. So right at the time that I was starting this second book, California released all of their prison records, and among them were the records from San Quentin, and there was Josiah Crouch. He had been incarcerated in San Quentin prison on account of felony, and he served 2 years and so many months of a 3-year sentence in San Quentin. And we got his mug shots. Well, there was no question about writing this book. I had to get that in there. And the second ghost story book has the story of Josiah. He not only his mugshots, but we found the names of at least 13 wives, and he lost two through death. Sarah's, the one he strangled, we think, and his own death, because he was married at the time he died. And I think he was divorced 3 times, so that left 8 unaccounted for. And several of his wives, several of those he married several times with other people in between. He was a busy guy, and so anyway, but all along the way, of course, there's history about what was going on. A lot of interesting history about the status of law enforcement in those days, and one of the things that Josiah did that did get him, he did have to serve some time in Nebraska, I think. He took on as clients, apparently, I mean, we don't know for sure, but it would appear, uneducated black men, and he represented them in court, but saw to it that they lost, and he came out smelling like a rose from that, and the reason was that they couldn't read what he was writing down, and so he was misrepresenting them, and he got caught on that, and he did go to prison. He wasn't. And Larry Moranti, who is a friend of mine, a singer-songwriter in Seattle, wrote a song about Mrs. Crouch, the Ballad of Mrs. Crouch. And his chorus, he talks about Reverend. And what he says is, he was not a righteous man. That's Reverend Crouch, where he was not a righteous man. But I thought the part, there are a lot of things in that story and the others, but I thought the part about taking advantage of, an attorney taking advantage of uneducated blacks or whites, it doesn't matter, but that obviously was a big problem at that time. And it's another aspect of our complicated lives that you don't really think about too much, but was worth writing about. Yes?
It shows a pattern on his part of preying on vulnerable people.
Absolutely, yeah. He was not a righteous man. No, but he was, I don't know, what you say, I guess the only thing I can say is he was ballsy. He just was. He just, he just kept on keeping on. He did get caught in it, and he was disbarred, of course, when he went to San Quentin, and so when he got out, that didn't bother him at all. I don't know how he passed the bar in Washington, but he did, and he wasn't even supposed to come into Washington, I don't think. And in several other states he passed the bar. And then he went to court and tried a case in LA. As far as I know, LA's always been in California, but didn't matter. He just did what he wanted. Lots of newspaper coverage on him, and that Ralph got all of that stuff. If you do Ancestry at all, you can subscribe to the old newspapers that they're digitizing, and there's just tons of interesting material in that. So that's all I have to say. Oh, no, I have one more thing. I want to know if you have any suggestions for people from earliest times onward, and I want some advice too, from North County in this area that, you know, would be great for my saints or sinners.
Bob Bailey.
Bob Bailey,
Mm-hmm.
okay. Bob Bailey, and there's lots of information about him, right?
Yes.
Great.
You just go to the Washington State archives, and there's tons of information.
Is it online?
Yeah.
Okay. And what do you think about some of those characters from Swan who were in this area, but it wasn't yet Pacific County? Should I include them in the Saints or Sinners?
James Swan?
Well, James Swan, when James Swan lived here, it wasn't Pacific County. It is now, but where he lived, and the people he talks about in his books that, you know, were real people and certainly characters, and certainly sinners and saints, were not living in Pacific County, but it's Pacific County now. So the question is, should I include them?
So, yeah, yes.
You vote yes?
It's your call.
It's
You're the authoress.
I
Same territory.
hate that. That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same territory and it's very much part of the history.
Okay, so because that gives me a lot of more,
There's a woman from Bay Center, her name is Hope Wilson, and she died in the same bed that she was born in. And in her youth, she played piano for silent movies. And then eventually, she lived in Bay Center, and Wilsonville
oh,
is at the mouth of the Niawakam across the street from, well, the whole cannery of Nisbet's. It's Wilsonville, and that's where she grew up, and that's where she lived, and that's where she died.
was Wilson her maiden name?
Wilson, yes.
Was she never married?
Yes, she did, because her great-granddaughter got a hold of me one time. I'll have to do a little looking, because
Okay.
it's either the last Southwester or the one before that, there was a little excerpt about what she wrote about Thanksgiving festivals in Bay Center, which are pretty wild.
Isn't that the person who lived in Bay Center and would row up the river to Raymond
Yes,
to play?
yes.
That just
Oh, the way-
overwhelmed.
The way these people, like the Fredericksons, the people that got murdered across the river,
Mhm.
they rode everywhere. There was just the slough that you can drive by their slough. It's about this wide at high tide, and that's how they got around.
Yeah.
Of course, Ray Hicks is a real character. I mean, I interviewed him for 20 hours when I wrote that magazine, and I should have kept going because he lived quite a bit longer even. But and he somehow got sick. He was in the hospital, and he sent me pictures from the hospital in the hospital bed. But yeah, I mean, if I can, there are some interesting folks in
Yeah.
here. We have, and I don't know, we have a large collection of oral history, and I think it's in our annex building. I'd have to go look and see.
What form is it in? What form is it in?
Cassettes,
Cassettes?
yes.
Can we still?
Well, we'll give you a cassette player.
Okay. Yeah, 'cause I don't think I have one anymore. Oh,